I think it's a good time to be talking about skill expression in Pokemon Unite, so today's tier list is all about that. What Pokemon take and show the most skill in a player, and what Pokemon are just pressing A. Let's get into it. It's Monday. On Mondays, we do tier lists, and on Wednesdays, we wear pink.
On October 3rd, he asked me what day it was.
It's October 3rd.
Let's take a look at our tier list for this week. We have our tiers. The God tier. This Pokemon is going to be the most skill intensive and showing the most skill expression inside the game, meaning a high skill level player is going to look amazing on this thing. We're only going to have one Pokemon in our God tier. We're not friggin' Norse around here. We've got our S tier, the super high skill tier. Saw how I broke that up, right? We have our A tier, the A skill showcase tier. We have our B tier. I don't even want to get into it. We still got the B tier. These are going to be Pokemon that are, yeah, kind of middle of the road, as you would expect. We have our C tier, the Caroline. It's not that hard tier. I imagine I'm talking to someone named Caroline, and they think these Pokemon are difficult to play, and they simply aren't. We have our D tier, the Decidueye Memorial tier, a tier named after Decidueye when Decidueye was so bad, it got its own tier. And finally, we have our F tier for A-pressers. I wonder what Pokemon is going to end up in that tier. Come along with me as we celebrate tiers in this week's tier list. We might as well start talking about the elephant in the room, and that's Mewtwo. Why? The reason I wanted to make this tier list is because I've noticed that a lot of the top Pokemon in the game right now are also extremely low skill. They're Pokemon that can be played by just about anybody and get good results. And let me be clear about something. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a bad thing that all of these Pokemon also happen to be extremely overpowered. I actually think there's so much value in playing a Pokemon that is not difficult to do well with, especially if you're just learning the game. Mewtwo Y is a great example. This Pokemon is, it's not difficult to do well with this Pokemon. Obviously, we need to nerf it into the ground, burn it with fire, find who designed it, and give them a stern look, a mean look, if you will. Just put them in jail. Do something about it. Okay, Mewtwo is insane. I think while we're talking about Mewtwo Y, we can talk about Mewtwo X. While Mewtwo X, I wouldn't say is F tier skill level. I would say it's kind of into the C tier. It's so overpowered that you could easily see it put into the Decidueye Memorial tier, and I don't think that would be crazy, especially upon release. But at this point, I would say it's maybe closer to the C tier as far as skill expression. You kind of have to understand when to fight and when not to fight, and it's much, much harder than Mewtwo Y. That being said, I don't know. They're both kind of in this range a little bit, while Mewtwo Y being the least skill-intensive Pokemon that the game has basically ever released. It's just crazy, especially considering its power level. Now, power level and the amount of impact you have in a match is definitely part of this list, but it's not the only thing that you're going to find in this list. So when you look at something that's super high skill, it also doesn't necessarily mean that that is going to have insanely high impact. There are some Pokemon in the game that take a ton of skill and they don't have a ton of impact right now. Like, they're good, but they're not broken in any sense. And then there are other Pokemon that take way less skill and provide way more impact. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about something like Blaziken, a Pokemon that was just released. I would say Blaziken is one of the higher skill Pokemon inside the game. It's either in our S or our A tier for this Pokemon, and it also does not have the reward of expressing its skill that something like Mewtwo Y or Mewtwo X necessarily has. It's a good Pokemon. Glasses on! For all of you wondering when the glasses would be on, you guessed it just right. It's right now. Glasses on. When it comes to Blaziken, I think there's a lot of skill expression. People who are very good with this Pokemon do some really impressive things. And it's also somewhat powerful, decently powerful, but it definitely doesn't reward you as much as other Pokemon for the skill you're putting in. Let's talk about another Pokemon that's kind of middle of the road, maybe even closer to C, and that's something like Zacian. Zacian on release, I would say, was probably down in the D tier. But now that you actually need to balance Zacian's passive Intrepid Sword a little bit more, and it's not as much of a delete button as it used to be, I think this Pokemon has risen up in the amount of skill that you can sort of express with this. You could see a more clear difference between good Zacians and bad Zacians. Whereas, I mean, you can always see a difference between good Mewtwo eyes and bad Mewtwo eyes, but I think you get what I mean, right? It takes more to be better with Zacian right now. I could see an argument that it's still closer to a C tier right here, but I would say it's kind of middle of the road skill expression for a Pokemon like this, while at the same time, being moderately good with Zacian is probably a lot better than being pretty dang good with Blaziken. And that's just the nature of the game. Some Pokemon are stronger than others, especially depending on what balance patch we're in at the current moment. Another Pokemon that I'd like to talk about with like very high skill expression is something like Zarina. I think Zarina is a super high skill intensive Pokemon, and at times this thing was busted good, especially with top tier players, and right now it's doing okay. It could be better, but Zarina's a weird one because if you start buffing this Pokemon, the players who are really cracked with Zarina start looking like absolute gods inside the game. Zarina is a really solid Pokemon. Upon release, I would say its skill expression was a little lower just because it was so overpowered. You could kind of just triple axle no matter what and recover too much health. It made no sense. But at this point, I would say Zarina is kind of sitting in this high skill expression tier with decent impact inside the game. Let's try to find something that kind of sits more into our A tier right here. And this is going to be an interesting one. I'm not sure what I want to start with, but you know what? I'll start with this. Let's start with Delphox. I think Delphox is a high skill expression Pokemon in the game with the Flame Charge Mystical Fire build. It's a specific sort of moveset where you have to sort of understand the slide and the in and out of Delphox. We're not exactly talking about Fire Spin right here. And one thing that's interesting is some Pokemon based on their moveset are a little higher, and then based on their moveset are quite a bit lower. So there are some Pokemon with a moveset that's just a lot simpler than the other version. And talking about the Pokemon generally, I'll try to make it clear which moveset I'm focusing on a little bit more if I think it's relevant. So for Delphox with the high skill expression, I would say you're looking at something like Flame Charge Mystical Fire. While I do think there's a lot of value in Fire Spin, I also think it's not as high skill. The thing about Fire Spin is your positioning is extremely important. And the thing about Mystical Fire Flame Charge is your positioning is not only extremely important, but your micro and your ability to move around combat effectively while still landing. You've got to basically... It's like a little game of angles, right? It kind of reminds me of pool in a weird way, where you've got to sort of line up your shot where you are and where the fire is going to be all coincide with still getting a hit so that you can continue fighting and resetting your moves in a crazy way. I think Delphox is a pretty high skill expression Pokemon. The thing that keeps it out of the S tier for me is its resets are not that difficult to attain. Once you kind of understand the bit of movement behind it, it's not the craziest thing in the world, and its Unite move is on such a low cooldown that you can kind of just get away with murder with that Pokemon. Definitely a high skill Pokemon though, for sure. Let's see if I can find something that feels a little more C tier for me. C tier is kind of a hard one, because C and D tier, I feel like are going to be pretty dang close inside this game. A C tier Pokemon, let's try to find, here's kind of a C tier one. And I think you're going to find some defenders in this area. I think there's a lot that Mamoswine can do inside the game, but I don't think the skill expression is super high unless you start talking about Ice Fang, where I think Ice Fang would bump it up to like somewhere in this range, maybe closer to the B tier. Mamo's solid. It's really difficult to fight it early on inside of a match, and at the same time, I just don't think that it's put in a position a lot where you have to do the most skill thing possible. I think as a defender, it's pretty middle of the road, and a lot of defenders are not the highest skill expression Pokemon inside the game. So Mamo sits kind of in the C-ish, B-ish tier category for sure. All right, so after the Mamo of the Swine, where do we want to go next? Let's go with something like Pikachu. Pikachu also, I feel like, sits kind of in this C tier right here. It's a very good Pokemon. I think Thunder Thunderbolt obviously has more skill expression than Volt Tackle Electro Ball, but Pikachu is pretty simple to use and very, very powerful right now. I think it's a really solid pick inside the game. I would highly recommend a lot of new players play a Pokemon like this. You're at range, your Unite move comes back fast, Thunderbolt's easy. Volt Tackle Electro Ball is even easier. Like, Volt Tackle Electro Ball truly is D tier, no question. And I think Pikachu is a pretty solid choice for a lot of newer players. I love it, and I do want to reiterate, I'm not trying to hate on Pokemon that have a low sort of skill expression. I think there's definitely room inside the game for all different kinds of Pokemon. Where do we want to go next? Let's go with maybe something a little higher skill. Let's go with Talonflame. Talonflame, I feel like, is a pretty high skill ceiling and high skill. Honestly, like, the skill floor is pretty low on this Pokemon as well. So if you're bad with it, it really shows. And if you're good with it, it really shows. It doesn't make it up into the S tier for me because I don't think you have to be as mechanically intensive as something like Blaziken or Zarina, but it is a really solid Pokemon for high skill players. You can make some really impressive plays with it. Obviously, the risk reward for Talonflame is always pretty high, right? Like, you have to be next to your opponents to fight. You're very, very squishy. And at the same time, you can make a lot of mistakes, like just capping and putting your teammates in a tough position right there. I think Talon feels like a pretty high skill Pokemon. Let's throw something up here that is what's kind of like middle of the road, like B tierish that I want to throw. You know what? Charizard feels like something like that. All-rounders, I think more of them might kind of sit in this middle area right here, except for a few that are very high skill. Charizard's fine. I think, you know, you've got to learn how to get your experience with this Pokemon. You have to understand when to use your Unite move. Outside of that, I don't think it's insanely skill intensive, although it is a really fun Pokemon to play, one of my favorites to play inside the game. I don't think you need an insane amount of skill to be good with Char. However, you will get a lot of players that just simply don't get their experience, and you're going to run into really low-level Charmeleons. We know the issue with the 3 Evo Pokemon, but I can't really put that into the skill expression of it. I think Char is about middle of the road right there. Another Pokemon that's about middle of the road, I think, is Alolan Ninetales. I think Alolan Ninetales is pretty easy to be good with. It's a little more complex than something like Pikachu as a mage inside the game, but it's not that complex. As soon as you just understand how Blizzard Avalanche works, basically, you're pretty set to go right here. Your Unite move is easy. All you have to do is press the button and it hits everybody around you. It's a little more complex, I want to say, than the Chew in some ways, and I think the reason I'm feeling like that is just because of Aurora Veil. It's not that Aurora Veil Dazzling Gleam is... It feels simple. You put down the Aurora Veil and you stand in it and you hold A, right? But I think the positioning of this is actually one of the more difficult things about Alolan Ninetales. And I do think Blizzard Avalanche is a little more skill intensive than sort of a long range like catch with Thunderbolt, but still not the toughest thing in the world. I think B tier is pretty fair for a Pokemon like that. Let's talk about a mage that I think is a little higher, and that's Gardevoir. Gardevoir, I think, is a little higher because, especially with Future Sight, I just think you have to be a little better at anticipating your opponents and lining up your shots. Also, its Unite move is more difficult to hit than all of the mages we've talked about before. Pikachu, Ninetales, even Delphox. Delphox also is very forgiving with its Unite move, right? Gardevoir can be the most whiffed Unite move inside the entire game. You just throw it, you thought they were there, you knew they were on the goal, but they all just kind of walked away as soon as they saw you moving up. It could be a real tragic one. I think Guardy is a pretty decently skill-intensive Pokemon. Not only do you need the positioning from Delphox, but you also have to recognize that you have very little movement as a Pokemon, so you just have no way to reposition yourself in a lot of these moments. So I would say it kind of hangs out probably up in our A tier right here. Let's take a look. While we're talking about some of the mages, Chandelure. Shandy's middle of the road. I think Shandy is fine. I think its Unite move can be a little tricky because it's so easy to get stunned out of. But outside of that, I think Chandelure is pretty reasonable. Nothing super crazy about it. In some ways, I think it moves down towards the C tier, but also with 0 movement, with having to balance its boosted attack, with its Unite move being cancelable. I think it's a little more complex than something like Pikachu, but still not the hardest Pokemon in the game to be good with. Let's kind of move on to some more of our attackers. Espeon, I feel like, hangs out in this area as well. Nothing crazy. When it was busted, like when Psyshock was absolutely broken, it might have even went down towards the C tier, but you know, you have to be able to aim your shots. Then again, you have stored power where you don't have to be able to aim your shots. I think it kind of hangs out in this area right here. It's not crazy. You do have to be near opponents for its Unite move. It's right here. It's honestly, of the ones I've talked about, I think it's the most on the borderline with the C tier, just because of how simple stored power is. I think that would kind of put it right there. Let's see. Sylveon. Sylveon's an easy one, man. Sylveon's pretty easy. Mystical Fire's easy. Hyper Voice is easy. Sylveon might even be in our D tier. It is a simple Pokemon to pick up. I don't know if it's Mewtwo level simple, but it's a pretty basic one to pick up, and it's easy to do well with. You evolve at 4. All your moves aren't that tough. Hyper Voice is a little tougher than Mystical Fire, but it's a pretty low skill Pokemon. You can do some cool things with it and not be very good at the game. So if you're just starting out and you want a fun Pokemon, I think Sylveon's like a pretty good call. Let's see. Do we have any other attackers that are kind of mage? Like we have Glaceon. Glaceon's a weird one. So Glaceon's C or D. The thing about Glaceon is Icy Wind. If we're just talking about Spear, I think Glaceon's kind of D tier. It's pretty simple to understand what's going on right here. You have to juggle your spears and stuff like that. Icy Wind, however, kind of falls more into the B tier for me, maybe even a little higher, just because you have to constantly make sure that you have your spears charged up, or you're kind of doing nothing inside of a match. I think for that reason, for that kind of swing and skill expression right here, I'm going to place it in the C tier. But just know, Glaceon is not a super difficult Pokemon to do very, very well with inside Pokemon Unite, especially when it was broken. The only other mage I can see on the list, I think... Oh, well, we got a couple. I'm going to put Mew up here. Mew is a S tier Pokemon for sure. Mew is one of the higher skills Pokemon inside the game. Even though it's not as broken as it used to be, it's still phenomenally good. And when you see good Mew players, it really is a thing of beauty. I think Mew is one of the higher skill expression Pokemon in the game. Probably the highest mage, except for there are a few like Pokemon to talk about right here. But it's one of the higher skill expression Pokemons in the entire game. It's really, really impressive. Another one is Cramorant. So, Cramorant's... Surf Hurricane build is fine. It's probably B tier, right? But Cramorant's Dive Air Slash build is an insanely high skill build. Especially, and when I say that, you can do okay with it if you're just okay. But if you're really good, especially with this Pokemon and this build, the stuff you do, it's disgusting. Like, you break ankles more than any Pokemon breaks ankles inside of Pokemon Unite. It's one of the most impressive Pokemon in the game, played by a high skill player, and it's also the reason I think that this Pokemon has received so many weird nerfs over the span of Pokemon Unite, is just because really cracked players pick this up, and it's just truly insane. Another mage here. It's kind of a mage, and then it's got kind of like a brawler sort of build. I think Venusaur kind of sits in the middle right here. You get a little more skill expression sometimes out of Beam, but at the same time, Beam is pretty easy also. I would say a lot of Venusaur is relatively simple. You just have to understand how it works, but once you understand how it works, I don't think there's really much going on with Venusaur that's particularly complex. So I'd put Venusaur kind of in this B area. I could even see an argument that it's maybe a little closer to C, but Venusaur is fine. It's not too tough to figure out, and once you do, you can get some pretty good value inside of a match. Let's see. Those are all of our mages except for Inteleon. So I don't know what to do with Inteleon. What do we do with Inteleon? Here's the thing. Snipe Shot is a pretty high skill intensive build. It's either A or S for Snipe Shot. The damage it does is a little too much for it to be probably S at times. Like, you just hit one Snipe Shot and you can KO people sometimes. But at the same time, Liquidation is not difficult. Liquidation is a C, sometimes D. However, Inteleon's critical hit counter is more complex than just having, naturally high crit, and then you just hit everything with naturally high crit. I think I think I have to create a new tier. Hold on. We're going new tier. We're going... Who knows? Really. The who knows really tier is for Inteleon, because I don't really know what to say about Inteleon right here. I mean, if it's Snipe Shot, it's pretty high. I would say it's S or A on Snipe Shot. And if it's Liquidation, I would say it's C or D, maybe even F. At times. It's a sure hit with all of those critical guys. Like, it's so good. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to say about Inteleon. Here's the thing. If Inteleon wasn't so busted, you might see something else out of this. But given that Inteleon is that busted, I just think it's, yeah. It's so confusing where to put this Pokemon. I have to put it in the who knows really tier. It's choose your own adventure when it comes to the skill expression of Inteleon. Although I think even at its lowest, it's maybe C. I don't think it's D, but even at its lowest, it's still pretty low. I mean, Liquidation's pretty busted. It really is. Okay. We've done a lot of attackers here. Let's just kind of finish up attackers. I think Cinderace is C. Probably C tier. I don't think it's super hard. I think Pyro Ball Feint's a little tougher than Blaze Kick. It's an A-presser, and I don't think it's particularly tough. Dragapult kind of sits in this category as well. It might be a little tougher at times, and then at times it's a little easier. They're both pretty simple. I think Dragapult, Dragon Dance might be a little harder than Cinderace. I'm going to put it slightly higher. I don't think these Pokemon, they're not nothing. Here's the thing about auto attackers like this. Is you have to understand positioning very, very well inside of a game. That's one of the things that these ADCs actually teach you. Really good auto attacker players, like really, really good Cinderace players, really good Dragapult players, things like this, they understand positioning really, really, really well. Because if you just walk face first to enemies, you're done, unless you're Mewtwo-Y, and that's a whole other discussion. But Greninja, another auto attacker, but I think Greninja is one of the higher skill expression Pokemon in the entire game. Especially given its current power level. If it was busted, broken, its skill expression would still be high because Greninja takes some skill to play. But the fact that it's so middle of the road while at the same time taking high skill to be really, really effective, I think Greninja is definitely one of the S tier skill expression Pokemon inside of Pokemon Unite. You have sort of 2 attack ranges, you have resets on your moves, but you have to get KOs, you're very, very squishy. I think Greninja is a really solid example of a high skill Pokemon that has some pretty high reward. Decidueye, I think, takes a decent amount of skill. It's definitely not the hardest thing inside the entire game, but being good with Snipe Shot is a tough thing to do, and being good with Razor Leaf is impossible. So I think Decidueye's skill expression, while not being like S tier, I do think you could see some really impressive stuff with a very, very good Decidueye. It's another one of those Pokemon that I just love to play. The sniping on it, just such a comfort zone for me, and I have so much fun with it. Duraludon, another auto attacker that I don't feel like is particularly tough. I think Duraludon's kind of a C tier Pokemon. Flash Cannon in some ways is tougher just because you're such a sitting duck. Dragon Pulse is sort of like, hey, you can rip it, you can rip things down, and you can make the enemy really regret that they left Duraludon hanging out. Its autos are also extremely brutal. Its Dragon Tail lets you reposition pretty well. I don't think Duraludon's a particularly tough Pokemon to play. And those are really all of our attackers here inside of Pokemon Unite, so let's kind of bounce around a little bit. What might be fun next? We've talked about a lot of things sort of middle of the road. Let's talk about some things that I think are lower on the skill list, and those are defenders. A big culprit is Lapras. I think Lapras is one of the best Pokemon in the game without question, and one of the least skill intensive. Maybe it's not F tier. That might be a tier only reserved for Mewtwo, to be fair. But its moves hit in an area. They're really easy to hit. You're the tankiest thing ever. You have self-recover. Your Unite move is crazy. Like, Lapras is pretty basic. It's pretty basic, and it's really, really good. I think a D tier is a fair place to put something like a Lapras. Crustle is another Pokemon that I don't think is insanely tough. It might be B. I'm going to have to see where I shake out with the other defenders right here. It could be B, but it's probably C. I think Trevenant is another one that's C. Trevenant's great. Trevenant's easy to do well with. It only has to evolve once. Woodhammer's insane. Curse just hits in an area. Like, come on. You know what you're up to, Trevenant. You're not that difficult to play. Umbreon's D, dude. I'm sorry. Umbreon and Lapras, the kind of newest, little duo of defenders inside the game, are truly so easy to do well with. So easy. It's one of the toughest things in Pokemon Unite, is I feel like from a skill expression perspective, we haven't had as many high skill expression Pokemon in a little while, and Umbreon and Lapras are not hard at all. Goodra is a weird one. Goodra is like one of the weirder defenders for me. At times it takes a little bit. It really does. But then at other times you just press your Unite move, you can't be KO'd. It's in here. It's probably here. It's really good early too. I don't know. I don't think Goodra's that tough to be good with, to be fair. Let's move on to some more defenders. Slowbro. Let's face it, Slowbro is not hard to be good with. Slowbro is crazy easy to do well with, and it's the reason it's one of the best defenders in the game as well. Its Unite move is very simple, point and click, and you hold an opponent in place. That's insane. It's crazy good early. It recovers its own HP. It's secure as amazing. Like, Slowbro's nuts. Give me a break. This Pokemon's so simple to be good with. Let's see. Greedent, on the other hand, I think Greedent is a difficult Pokemon to be good with, especially Covet. Covet Belch is one of the harder moves for players to understand inside the game. And for Greedent to provide great value for the team right now, I think you actually have to be pretty decent. I think the Bullet Seed build is a little easier, so if you're having trouble with Greedent, Stuffed Cheek's Bullet Seed is probably... it's probably closer to B-ish, but Covet Belch and, definitely understanding how to control it and how to make it work, I think is one of the more intense skill expressions inside of Pokemon Unite in general, especially now that it's not busted like it was at one point. Snorlax, fine. I think it's a little harder than some of the tanks because it's just not as good as easy. I'd say it's fine. It's kind of middle of the road tank. Blastoise, okay. The tough thing about Blastoise is you need experience. Outside of that, I don't find Blastoise very difficult, especially Rapid Spin, Water Spout, even Surf Hydro Pump. Like, you get a lot of value out of Blastoise without doing too much. I think Blastoise is really not the toughest Pokemon to play. The only issue with Blastoise is you need to get your experience. And please, hear me, everyone. Wartortle, listen to me. Okay, buddy, we are 5 minutes into the match right now, or 6 minutes. You're still level 8. I'm begging you. Go find experience. Charmeleon? Hey, Charmeleon, I'm looking at you, buddy. Go get your level 9. Go get it. Leave this fight. I don't care. We don't need a Charmeleon anymore. You gotta be a Charizard right here, okay? 3-stage Evo Pokemon. Hear my calls. Please go get your final level. I'm begging you. Tyranitar, I see you there in the back. So we definitely need to do something about that for these Pokemon. However, the skill expression of them, not incredibly difficult. We have any more defenders on our list? I think that's all of our defenders. I think so. Let's move on. Let's do some speedsters here. These are usually high skill Pokemon, and I would agree a lot of them are pretty dang high skill. Absol, I think, is up there, probably an A tier Pokemon inside the game. Output wise, I don't think Absol's really killing it right now, but I do think Absol takes some pretty high skill to play, and especially to do well with. I think Absol, it's veering into the S tier right now. To get high value out of it, I think you have to be a very good Absol player for sure. Zeraora is another one that I feel like kind of hangs out up in this A tier. It's pretty close to the S tier as well. The fact that its moves kind of hit in an area, I think helps it, and its recent change to all its leveling definitely makes it so you don't have to be the most skilled player in the absolute world to get value out of. But in general, speedsters take a decent amount of skill for sure. Dodrio, S tier without question. Dodrio is one of the trickier Pokemon in the game to get a handle on. But once you do and you start to understand how Dodrio works, I think the value from Dodrio, even after multiple nerfs, is still very, very high. One of the higher skill expression Pokemon in the game and still provides a ton of value. Zoroark, probably the most skill-intensive speedster in the game and the one that you can get in some ways the most value out of with very, very high skill. If you watch the Unite Championship series, you saw some really cracked players on Pokemon. You saw some really cracked Dodrios. You saw some very cracked Zoroarks. I remember Overlord from the World Champion Team Luminosity. Like, it made this Pokemon look like the best Pokemon in the game. And in the hands of a pilot like that, it'd be hard to argue, right? So I think that's one of the best Pokemon inside of Pokemon Unite. And one of the highest skill ones as well. You have to have a lot of skill, but if you have a lot of skill with this, it's insanely good. Gengar is very high up there. Gengar's really, really high up there. It might even be moving into the S tier, honestly. Especially in this meta, I don't think Gengar does particularly well at times. There are certain matchups it plays well into and certain matchups where you're like, gosh, this is not crushing it right now. So I think Gengar is a really interesting one. Its controls don't lean it into the S tier for me. But at the same time, like, your positioning and knowing when to fight with Gengar is really, really, really high. Leafeon, I think, is the only speedster that I would move down towards our B tier. You don't need to be as good with Leafeon, even though you can show off really, really well with this Pokemon. It's kind of like the lowest A I could possibly give it, you know? It's very squishy, but its Unite move is on a 0-second cooldown, essentially. You do so much damage. It also fights at kind of a range that most of the speedsters don't. I don't know. I still think it might be like B. It's somewhere in here. I'm not really judging the Pokemon in these respective tiers against each other. It's like, it's borderline between A and B. It really is. It's probably the lowest skill speedster that I can see in the game. It's close. It's really, really close between these two. Yeah. Let's talk about a Pokemon that's not a speedster, but is a speedster, and that's Scyther. And I think Scyther is actually one of the higher skill Pokemon in the game. It's either S or A. It could be high A. It might not be as intense as some of these other Pokemon, but Scyther is essentially a speedster. Scizor is a different story. And it's, you know, it's burst. You have to jump into combat. I feel like Scyther, especially with how wonky its controls are on Switch, I feel like it actually might be an S tier choice. I think that's a pretty reasonable place to put Scyther. It's very, very good. And while we're on all-rounders, let's talk about our supporters. Haha, tricked you. Nice try, all you jerks out there. Let's see. Our supporters are a wild bunch because a lot of them are not very difficult to do extreme amounts of impact inside of a match. So let's start with one. Blissey. I think Blissey is either D or C. It is not difficult to play Blissey. You give your team so much value. You get a little more skill expression out of the egg build. Helping Hand Safeguard is so basic. The only thing you need to understand with Blissey is when to use Safeguard and when to Unite, basically, with Helping Hand Safeguard. That's it, really. Its early game is super easy. Egg is a little more complex because once you understand Egg Bomb, there's actually a decent amount of skill expression inside of Egg Bomb. You can knock opponents up, stop them from using certain moves, stop them from going home through Hoopa portals. But in general, Blissey is not a difficult Pokemon to be good with. Oh, I realized there's one other Pokemon making it to our F tier, and that's Comfey. I forgot. Comfey is, you know, what are you going to say about this thing? I guess you get some more skill expression out of Sweet Kiss and Grass Knot, but I guess I could punch you right in the mouth. No, it's not, guys. Yeah, it's Comfey. I don't feel like I even need to say anything. There's no question it belongs in our F tier. Clefable, pretty low skill expression. You get a little more with Draining Kiss, obviously, because it's more of a combat build. It hangs out right here with Blissey for the most part. You just have to position yourself so your allies are okay. Allies, are you okay? Are you okay, allies? Gravity is maybe a little more intense sometimes than Follow Me, but Follow Me also has some moves you can make. I just don't think it's very hard to do a lot with these Pokemon. Eldegoss is really, really low. I'm going to put it in our C tier. Just, I don't know. You've got to at least land Pollen Puff. Supporters are pretty easy for the most part. You can do some crazy good things with them, especially if you're really good with them. But some of these supports are not difficult to do well with. Mime, on the other hand, I would put pretty high on our list. Mr. Mime, when it was broken, don't get me wrong, like it was the easiest thing in the world. But Mr. Mime, especially right now, not being busted, you actually have to be pretty dang good with this Pokemon to get a lot of value out of it. You probably have an easier time with the Power Swap Psychic build than you do with Confusion Barrier. But still, both of those builds take a little work to actually make something happen inside the game right now. So Mr. Mime, I think, is a lot more difficult than the other Pokemon we talked about. Wigglytuff is kind of middle of the road. It's all right. You sing, you run near people. Rollout takes a little more positioning and skill. You almost have to like trap people in some very, very fun ways, but it's not that hard to be good with Wiggly, and it's really, really good early. Hoopa, on the other hand, is the only supporter that I would say is a super high skill supporter, and that is because Hoopa's portals aren't the most difficult thing, but you have to understand the macro of the game to really use the portals inside this well. And then Phantom Force is just... it's really impressive when you see a top tier Hoopa. Top tier Hoopas can do really insane things inside this game. And I think S tier is a very fair place to put Hoopa because you can show off in some insane ways with this Pokemon. And then we have Sableye. And Sableye is a weird one. I've been thinking about Sableye. Before I make my tier list, I kind of like go through it and I rank everything. And then as I'm doing it, I might move some things around as I'm doing it live. But Sableye is one of the weirdest ones, and I don't know where to put it. I have to be honest, I don't know where to put it. It feels like you actually need to be pretty dang good with this thing, but it's on its own track. It is completely... It's a separate entity from like every single thing inside of Pokemon Unite. I'm going to put it in the who really knows area. I think if I had to place it on the list, I'd probably put it B or A. Probably somewhere up in here. But then there are times where you can get so much done with Sableye and you're really not doing much at all. You're just kind of near something and you hit them and they're stunned for too long to do anything. So I'm going to put this down in the who really knows tier. And I think a lot of that is because for the longest time Sableye was like overtuned, and now it's not overtuned and you almost never see it anymore. And even when I play it, I'm thinking, I don't know, is this going to provide the kind of value I want? It's a weird one, man. You could see this one super high on the list and in some ways super low. So it has to hang out here with Inteleon in the who really knows tier. Let's move on to our all-rounders right here. A lot of these Pokemon I feel like are middle of the road, but some of them are pretty dang high skill expression as well. Let's talk about Azu. Azumarill, fine. Not too tough to do well with. You kind of have to understand your... how to engage late game with this Pokemon, but early it's really, really strong, and Water Pulse Plus is my favorite thing in the world. I don't think it's crazy difficult here to be pretty good with Azumarill, and its Unite move is kind of like lock on, go! So I wouldn't really worry about being too good with Azu. Machamp fits in this realm as well. The only thing that's a little tougher about Machamp is landing its Unite move, but it's easy securing wild Pokemon with Machamp's Karate Chop. It's not too difficult to engage. It's not too difficult to burst and do some damage. It's not the best Pokemon in the game, but it's also never really lagging behind either, and it's not that tough to do some really impressive stuff with. Aegislash, on the other hand, is a tough one. Aegislash is probably up here in our S tier. It could be closer to A for Aegislash. Probably that's the only reason my brain wants to do that. But at the same time, Aegislash... knowing how to go between its different forms, and not just like, yeah, you press the button, but no, understanding how there are times where you just have to stay shield, use your boosted to get HP. You want to move into sword form and do a ton of damage, but you're just not in the position for it. And then you can like wait out your cooldowns with this Shedinja doll, coming back into a wide guard. I feel like it's one of the more skill-intense Pokemon inside the game. If you're really good with it, it's super impressive. And if you're not so good with it, It's not very good. All right, Dark Bear is middle of the road, I would say. I feel like Dark Bear is actually tougher than a lot of our B tier. It's a weird one. Let's get Water Bear up there too. So here's the tough thing about Water Bear and Dark Bear is I do think the skill expression out of both of these Pokemon is pretty dang high. Although I also don't think it's that tough to do well with them, except, you know, in the first 4 levels because Kubfu is bad. I in some ways, like a really high skill Water Bear truly is S tier levels of skill. And then Dark Bear is probably closer to A. I think the busted thing about both of these Pokemon is even a moderately skilled version of these Pokemon are pretty dang good. But I can't deny that being really cracked on Water Bear and Dark Bear is extremely impressive, and you could do some nutty things inside of a match. So it's wild because they're not like, they don't remind me of like a Mew, where if they're bad, they're doing nothing, or a Greninja is an even better example. Like a bad Greninja does absolutely nothing inside of a game. A bad Water Bear isn't that bad, really. I mean, it's level 5 is still absolutely disgusting. Another one that's top tier, I have to put it up here, is Lucario. And the reason Lucario is S tier is because of extreme speed. It's one of the most difficult move sets inside the game to get insane value out of, especially in the current meta where things are just so bulky and they have too much CC. But in general, extreme speed Lucario is a top tier skill expression build inside the game. Power up punch, not as much. Even though you do need to understand how to play it, and it's not a low skill build, Lucario in general is a pretty high skill Pokemon. I don't think it's the toughest thing. Buzzwole, I think, is probably A or S. It's really high up here. It's a very, very skill-intensive Pokemon, I would say. If you're great with Buzzwole, man, you are so good. You are so good if you're great with Buzzwole. Its early secure is a little busted, and its resets aren't too bad. It might be closer to A. It's like right in here. It's like one of these two. I might even keep it S. It's really, really good. Let's see. Tyranitar, I would say, is B. The only thing about Tyranitar is you need your experience. But once you get your experience, you just kind of have to set up positions for you to be near the enemy. That's all. Tyranitar is all about figuring out how to be near the enemy long enough to get KOs without them running away. That's the big part. And then the first, 3-4 minutes of your game is all about farming. You just need to play Stardew Valley, plant your crops, grow real big. You need to hit your level 9 because until then, you're not that formidable. Garchomp, I would say, actually is a higher skill Pokemon than people give it credit for. It might be closer to A. It doesn't seem like it because it's just you hold A near enemies, but there's so much more. I think the thing about Garchomp is the hold A near enemies is such a small part of what Garchomp does, when a lot of what Garchomp is doing is moving the enemies around or catching them with your dash move into its unite move so that you can find some KOs, and then you start brawling. And its early game, you also have to understand how to juggle its boosted attacks to keep them up basically during the that first phase before the 850 spawn in the center. I think it's actually higher skill than most people would give it credit for. Scizor, not too bad, not too amazing either. I think a decently skilled Pokemon. There are times where it doesn't feel that skill intensive, but those Scizors don't really do too much. I actually think you need to be better with Scizor than you might think inside the game. And then we have Dragonite. Dragonite, I feel like, is one of the lower all-rounders inside the game. It's actually not that tough to be good with Dragonite. Yes, you have to understand how Hyper Beam works, and yeah, you kind of have to understand how Outrage works. Now, Outrage, I think, is actually a pretty viable build, and I think Hyper Beam is also just pretty simple to use. You're ranged as well, which is a huge advantage. Like, ranged Pokemon in general are oftentimes lower skill than high-range Pokemon, just because you're able to fight in a way where you're safe. And I think that is pretty beneficial. We've got Mimikyu on this list as well, who is not out inside the game yet. However, from playing Mimikyu in the PTS, I do feel like it'll be a pretty high skill Pokemon. I don't think it's S tier levels high, even though with Shadow Sneak, you could probably do some really insane stuff. Its Unite move is really simple. It doesn't feel like it needs too much to kind of get online. It doesn't evolve. But I do think people are going to have some pretty impressive stuff with Mimikyu, especially if they nerf Mewtwo-Y. Have I mentioned that they need to nerf Mewtwo-Y? And now finally, let's talk about our God tier Pokemon. There are a few in my head that I'm just like, I go back and forth between. And it's really hard to figure out which Pokemon I think is the most skill-intensive Pokemon in the game, because each one of the Pokemon that I think are the highest skill-intensive and the highest skill expression are all very different. But they all are really, really potent if you're good with them. I do feel like I have a hard time I feel like when I see players, glasses off moment, when I see players that are insanely good with this Pokemon, it really is a thing of beauty, and I think it's why it has to be my God tier choice, even though there are so many Pokemon that I think are high up here. By the way, if you're at this point in the video, leave your answer in the comments as to what you think I'm going to pick. I'll give you a moment right here as I stare directly into the camera. This is a good moment for you to leave your comment. I'm not doing anything. Tell me who I'm going to put here. Time's up. I'm going to put it there. It's Mew. I think it's Mew. I think all of these, every Pokemon in the S tier, I could see an argument for. Mew, I think, is just too specific. And when you see a good Mew, it's so impressive. It's like the most impressive thing you'll see in Pokemon Unite, I think. The Zoroark is close. Greninja's really close. I think Aegislash, I mean, Extreme Speed Lucario, really close. There are so many that are really, really good. But that is our tier list for this week. These are Pokemon up at the top, again, that are really, really high skill Pokemon. But when you're really good with them, man, they look amazing. And the ones near the bottom they're just not that tough to be good with. Let's face it. And now we do this. The thing is, Goodra is just, as a tank, it's a different kind of tank than any of the others. And yes, it has a Unite move that heals you a bunch, but knowing when to use your Unite, knowing how to engage with Goodra is actually one of the toughest things inside of Pokemon Unite. Every other defender has a really easy job, except for Goodra. But man, if you know how to make this Pokemon work, you put your team in a position where you are un-KOable, while at the same time, you're able to actually disrupt some of the tougher Pokemon to deal with, things like Mewtwo-Y and Dodrio and things like that. I feel like that's the reason Goodra is our God tier Pokemon of the week. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I love you all very much, and I'll see you all soon. Nerf Mewtwo.